physical environment. I just happen to look at the physical environment of cities, and I regard myself as falling into this tradition of geographers' interest in human-environment relationships. And of course, you can't get a better example of that than the environment that we actually built ourselves and manage ourselves. So I was the original applicant on this work that was funded by the Environmental Protection Agency. Now, it's going to look like a success story, but I'll be honest with you, at various times it wasn't a success story, including at the very beginning, because I was a bit surprised they actually gave us funding, largely because large parts were quite vague. They were certainly going to fund something in this area that especially focused on communities and on outreach. And I'm a very, very strong fan of this type of approach as to what the university should be doing, that we should be providing our expertise, not necessarily to the people who have access to us, but the ones who do not have access. So what you'll see is a story here, which is built upon a long-time research project that Tina started in geography many, many years ago, which was to do something quite simple. That was map the trees on streets in the city centre of Dublin. You might think, surely we know this information, did we plant them? Well, it turns out Dublin City Council had no idea what trees they had, where the trees were, or anything about them. They had good information about what was inside parks, but no information about what was on streets, largely because the records were never actually maintained. So the first job that Tina was engaged with was simply to find out where the trees were. And the reason we were interested in this is because, as a climatologist myself, I'm interested in how cities affect the climate. So you look for the three-dimensional objects in the cities. Clearly, they're the buildings, and I can get that information now increasingly. But you also need to know the information of the trees, because in some parts of the city, the three-dimensional element is in fact the trees, and they affect, of course, things like shadow patterns. They affect, for example, how much of the air quality engages with the trees. It affects, for example, how much the trees can take out of the atmosphere in terms of precipitation, et cetera, et cetera. So myself and Niamh had a long time collaboration around these issues about the urban environment. In fact, we saw this as a potential for actually establishing a master's in the urban environment. And it was predicated on this idea that we would actually put together a program of study and work with the community that felt maybe they were deprived of trees. Now, we're somewhat fortunate because at the stage we put this together, we already had contacts. And one of the major contacts was, in fact, Seoidín O'Sullivan, who treats trees and placing trees in a city almost like the city is a palette. So I don't know how many of you know the city centre of Dublin. There's one particular street in Dublin that has always been a sort of forgotten street. It's called Holy Street. There's a little park there called Liberty Park that's more often locked than not because of drug dealing. But she made an argument for turning Foley Street almost into an artistic palette and for planting trees all along the axis. Now, it's been hit and miss in Dublin, but I think Dublin City Council can be given some credit because they've actually engaged in a project in the northeast of their city, which is what they refer to as their urban forest. Sounds a bit grand to call it a forest, but I was actually down there the other day and the trees are actually looking pretty good along that street. And it's a pretty ugly street unless you put the trees in there. So all that to say is that this came out of a long-term engagement, and then we thought this would be the icing on the cake, that we'd try and get some funding to put together a story. So it won't fit, I don't think, into your classic citizen science. The citizen science was almost like an addendum to a fundamental idea, which was that the university itself and the geography department and our colleagues could work with the community to improve their environment. So that's where we came in. We came in because we argued that we could provide the sort of scientific, that's physical and social science expertise that would help the community. So it's less about them generating information for us, and it's more about us providing information for them and giving them, I think, a level of expertise to articulate their concerns about the environment they occupy. We knew Seoidín. Seoidín, as I said, they're very interested in the idea of tree planting. And if you look at her projects, she's very interested in this idea of what she refers to as graft. The idea that you could bring basic forestry issues back into the city, that you could plant apple trees, that people would experience what it's like to see food growing. So, for example, if you go to Dolphin's Barn, which is again experience regeneration. There's a section of it that's been given over to the planting of apple trees. And in the local men's shed there, she was trying to encourage them to be involved in things like making cider. So that's Seoidín. And the thing about Seoidín was she was based in Common Ground. And Common Ground is a very interesting organisation based in Inchicore, in Dublin. They have a space there which is right next to a lovely graveyard. Some lovely trees in the graveyard too, by the way. That's where the first president of this country is buried. Cosgrove is buried in that graveyard. It's called Golden Bridge. So Seoidín was located there. And the way our Common Ground work is very interesting because it is a community organisation, but they use art as the mechanism by which they engage with the community. And the other group involved there is Connect the Dots. Connect the Dots are very, very good. We came across their work before in basically putting together networks of people. The person, by the way, that's critical to this whole thing and converting it from that type of infrastructure to working with the wider community is Alma, who unfortunately can't be here. But a lot of the work you'll see as far as. So this was the basic structure. It's very simple. That was me with Tina and a few others. We were going to map all the trees in Dublin. And rather than do what Tina had done previously, was just map the trees in the city centre, we took upon ourselves to map all the trees in the city of Dublin, which is not where we are now, by the way, we're in Dunleary right down, but just across the border in the city of Dublin, which is about 120 square kilometres. And we're going to use that scientific evidence as the basis of working with the community so they could actually generate their own green map. In other words, we would give them as much and more information than Dublin City had to make the argument on their own behalf. So we weren't advocates for them. We were basically providing them with the tools necessary so they could make the case. And then the final part is action. Now, that sounds like a very, very simple linear structure, but right in between happened COVID, which disrupted lots of the planning. So the only thing that we actually got done exactly the way we wanted was the data mapping. Everything else then had to take a side pathway because of COVID. So the first thing was we got information from an organization called Blue Sky, who took a very, very detailed photograph of the city. And by that, I mean the resolution of about 12.5 centimeters. We took that image and myself, Tina, and students, too numerous to mention, basically digitized every single tree in the city. There's about 300,000 trees in the city. The nice thing about getting that information out was that we got the information about trees that are in the public space and trees that are in the private space. We overlaid those dots on top of a digital elevation model and estimated the tree height. So in other words, we start to get some information about perhaps the size of the canopy. If you make assumptions, then from the height of the tree, you can pretty much estimate its age, depending on the species, and you can make a reasonable guess about the size of the canopy. And you can also, by the way, estimate just how much timber is in the tree. All that to say that that's the information I need if I want to do some calculations about what type of ecosystem services it can provide. The thing we didn't have is we didn't have any species. So that's where our friends at CURIO came in. CURIO was set up by a company called Breadboard. And the idea was that they would use a mobile phone, you download the app, and then you could visit a tree and record information about it. Now, the two lads who set this up, they are both from Trinity. After about 5 years, I'm afraid they gave up the ghost. The company is now wound up. So I'm not sure if CURIO is going to continue. But the principle behind it is still the same, is that you can use that device there to capture information on trees. And that was all part of the data mapping. And then after that, we took that information to go into the co-creation. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through the data mapping, and then pass over to Niamh, who's going to talk about the co-creation process, which involves some things that we'd already planned to do, and then because of COVID, things that finally we were not able to do. But I guess the success of it is that Mapping Green Dublin still exists as an initiative within Dublin 8. So for me, that's the magic, but I could not have told you at the outset that that was going to be the outcome. So What you're seeing here is effectively the tree database that Tina, myself, and a bunch of students put together. And what it shows, of course, is the heights of trees. And what I've done is I've used color red to indicate height, so you pretty much can get the pattern out here. The oldest trees are in Phoenix Park. The oldest trees are on the North Circle Road. The oldest trees are on the South Circle Road. And then this is leafy suburban Dublin. That's why I actually started out this idea that this code word that we use in the news all the time to tell you that you're middle class is based not on your income, which we don't measure, but it's based upon the environment you occupy. So leafy green effectively means here. I often get annoyed with people on the north side, even though I live there now. Clontarf is just as green. I know the north side, but really is the mirror opposite what you get here. And you can see St. Anne's Park here. And if you actually generalized it, this is what you get. You can see clearly the very high is based upon standard deviations. Ballsbridge, Donnybrook. You can see there's gaps here, but that's only because that's grass. In other words, not trees. And you can see there's very few trees around the Bull Island. And of course, nothing at all in the port. So there's different stories there, but the fundamental thing is still the same. Now, our area is here. Stretches over to an area called Cherry Orchard and Inchicore. And you can see it's not as bad as the city centre. But then the city centre, the very, very city centre, particularly in this part here, which is very low, is also not really residential. In other words, if I had to map out population inside the city centre, you'd see that in the daytime, there's a big bunch of people, but at night time, it's over here that people are mostly living. So this is our area, Inchicore stretching into a little bit of Kilmainham, and not quite as far over as Cherry Orchard. And then this is what we use CURIO for. Now, we'd already started to collect species information, but we asked people specifically in this area here to use the map we already had, so they knew the trees were there, and then to record information using CURIO about what type of tree it was. Now, the advantage of this is that you can get information about what might be planted in people's back gardens. Now, you need this information because the ability of trees to do various things is largely dependent upon its canopy. Certainly from a biophysical point of view, and from a biodiversity point of view, you need to know about the diversity. So when I start to evaluate the ecosystem services provided by trees, I need to know about the dimensions of trees, and I need to know about the species. And if I don't know enough about the species, then frankly, I have to guess. So there's software that exists. Now, it's fairly crude, but nevertheless, this software is now used internationally. It's called iTree, and they have a whole suite of models, but the one we use is iTree Eco, which does require you to know the location of the tree. It does require that you tell about the dimensions of the tree, specifically the diameter breast height, and it needs to know the species. So what we did was very, very simple. I simply took the information that we had for the trees we had inside Inchicore, and that's what's listed here. And then I treated the rest of the city, if it had the same mixture of species, to calculate what type of work they're doing for the entire Dublin city area. And you can see in terms of, say, sequestration in terms of tons per year, and the total amount of carbon stored, 326, I think that's tons, sorry, and that's the total amount for the city as a whole. By the way, you'll never ever plant enough trees to take the carbon out, just not remotely possible. So you're not planting trees to basically take the burden of all the stuff we do inside the city. But what you can do is use trees strategically, obviously, to improve the environment. And if carbon benefits come out of it, all the better. But the one thing I'd say when people talk to me about the trees and the planting, I say, yes, public trees, but you have to remove the cars also. So it's not like you get both, because the amount of space in the city for actually planting public trees where it matters is limited by the roads. So one has to go. In fact, you see this again in the Dublin city centre. If you look at the north inner city, and particularly along a street that'd be quite famous for many of us, Sheriff Street, it's very interesting the way they've actually planted the trees. The extension Sheriff Street, they actually just took out parking spaces. So it's one or the other. And then we did some various calculations, just to look at the carbon sequestration and compare it against traffic. So we have the basic traffic information, which is on the line. I have the tree information for a point. So what we did was we gridded the data. Now you can see that the trees in the park consume carbon net, simply because here there's very little traffic. You can see in this part of the world, which includes into core, the amount of emissions are actually very, very high. In fact, this is one of the reasons people wanted trees. It wasn't so much necessarily they wanted trees themselves, but they want to improve the area, and as part of what they regard as traffic management also. So you can see the major routes into the city and the ability of the trees to take the carbon back out again. Myself and Tina did a calculation for the city centre, and we estimate that all the trees in the city centre account for maybe about a day's worth of carbon emissions from the cars. So that was the evidence. This evidence then was brought to the community, and then we had a discussion with them. The co-creation was literally about making a plan for their part of the city. And the reason for the scientific part was to provide them with exactly and more information than Dublin City had. So now they could make an argument about how deficient they were in terms of trees, but they could also make an argument about where the trees should be located. So I'm going to let Niamh take over now, and she'll take us through the steps that we took to try and engage the community in actually creating that plan.
Thanks, Gerald. So thank you very much, and thanks everybody. So as Gerald said, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the second phase of the project. And I suppose one of the things to start off by saying is that very normally when we talk about citizen science, we think about citizens who are gathering data to give to us, but we then use as the scientists. And what we were trying to do with this particular project was turn that on its head, so that we would be generating a lot of some of the ideas in the science that we would then give back to the community to allow them to use the data. So in a way, we were kind of trying to turn the whole kind of citizen science idea on its head by empowering the community themselves to be asking questions, to be doing those things that we sometimes traditionally do. So we had a range of I suppose, co-creation events, but I really just want to speak to these two, which I think are most relevant to our topic today. One is the Plots project, and one is the community launch event. So I'm going to speak very particularly really in more detail about the community events that we ran. But the Plots one is interesting because, as Gerald said right at the start, COVID happened in the middle of this. So we had all these plans for being out in the community and doing things, and all of a sudden we were all locked down to within 2 kilometers of where we lived. So we had to rethink how were we actually going to gather data. And we had a number of things. So we had as part of this, and we do have the Mapping Green Dublin website, which we keep live, so you can see all of this on it. But we did generate a number of what we called at the time plus projects. So these were projects that weren't anticipated as part of the original proposal, but they emerged because COVID forced us to think differently. And Plots was one of these. So Plots was developed by Seoidín, who was the artist, and it was a really interesting idea. So this was launched on April 24th, 2020. So those of you who have the memory of March 12th, 2020 seared into their brains like I do, because I had 100 second-year geography students on Slieve League Cliffs when we were all told to come home. We were going into lockdown. This is only 6 weeks into lockdown. So we really had to think quickly about our community engagement. We were supposed to have all these in-person focus groups and events and so on, but we couldn't. So how were we going to keep the project going? And this was Seoidín's idea, and I think it was fantastic. So basically what she suggested was, one of the things that had come out of some of our discussions, our early discussions with the community, was around the fact that there were, if you like, no-go areas within the area that people really didn't use or didn't like because the environment was seen as being unsafe, unpleasant, all of those things. So Seoidín came up with this idea of, well, let's gather that data by getting people to map out their walking routes during COVID. Because you remember, we all got really interested in exercise because there was nothing else to do. So we're all out walking every day. And Seoidín thought, well, let's harness that. So what she did was got people to literally track on their mobile phones or on a physical piece of paper and then scan it, the routes that they were walking during COVID. So we got maps like the one that you can see at the top here with the red outline. That's somebody's walking route. We had other people who drew out where they would walk and where they wouldn't walk within the area. And all of that was brought together into a series of individual maps that people had generated, but also a composite map, which then allowed us to see the kinds of environments that people were frequenting or they were avoiding, primarily because of issues around the quality of the environment that they were inhabiting. So it was a way of gathering data from the wider community, and we put it out on social media, we put it up on our website, and this was our, I suppose that was our kind of visual identity for it. So be part of the change in your neighbourhood, make your daily walk, run, stroll or cycle, and exercise in plotting for Dublin's future. So you're invited to create a map of your current 2K walk or cycle route. So this was a really clever way of using the lockdown in a positive way to generate the kinds of information we were interested in as part of the project. Then the second thing we did, and Gerald said to me earlier, those slides are out of sequence, and he's right, because this actually came before plots. But I just wanted to talk about plots separately first and then think about this. One of the things we really wanted to do in terms of co-creation was getting the community to map out their perceptions of the environment. And this became a really important data gathering exercise. We ran a number of focus groups with people that we had identified as important actors in the area through Common Ground. But then we also ran this open community launch event on the 7th of March 2020. We had big debates about whether we should do it or not, and we went ahead and did it just as well, because we probably wouldn't have been able to do it if we hadn't. And we literally had a local school in the area opened up. We had a range of different maps. We had people mapping things like green space. We got these stickers made up. So there was green, orange, yellow for each thing. So you'll see little bicycles. So if something was a good place for cycling, you put a green cycle sticker down. If it was a real danger area, you put a red sticker down. And for various other things like trees, green spaces, cycling, that's what you're seeing on this particular map. But we did this for a lot of different things. And what you start to see happening here is clusters of green, clusters of yellow, areas that you can look at that are red going, okay, there's no trees there. So this was a really hands-on, very material way of gathering community information by those living in the area themselves. So we did this for lots of different things. There's the actual physical big maps on tables with the stickers that people were sticking down on them. Alma then painstakingly put them all onto, I think she used CAD or something like that to do it, onto this map. And then we were able to identify kind of opportunities within the area, deficits within the area, and strengths within the area. And one of the things that was really important for us in terms of engaging with the community and people living there was that we weren't just asking them about the problems. We wanted to know what they also saw as the strengths in their areas. And I think that's something that we really need to bear in mind when we're doing citizen science. We usually go out looking for problems, and that actually has an impact on the people we're engaging with. So we deliberately went out looking for strengths within this area as well. So you can see the kind of overall kind of mapping that came up here. And I think we ended up with, we gave people little stickers. They could write qualitative comments as well as just putting the stickers down. So we ended up with about 155 comments, as well as the stickers on the maps that we were able to then analyse. So we had great fun. We had lots to do when the lockdown actually came, because we had all this data from the community. So what we did then was we kind of came up with, as qualitative researchers do, key themes. So we talked about green amenity. And I should say, this is a bit confusing. It's just struck me. This yellow doesn't mean the same as the yellow on the previous slide. So yellow, it just means green amenity. But we're able to identify and categorize. All of these are actual comments that came from people. So things like health and well-being issues came up. Issues around care and maintenance of green space came up, governance, safety, development pressures within the area, and so on. There was a cluster of comments on the green environment under the same kind of codes, if you like, in terms of governance, health, development, care, and safety and connectivity. And similarly under green mobility. So we have mobility, environment, and amenity with the same subcodes, if you like, around the edges, and all of the individual comments that we got from people categorized into these. So actually, even these alone were really helpful for the community because they suddenly had a structure that they could then engage with Dublin City Council on, because here was data, they had the map, they had specific places people were identifying as dangerous or in need of intervention, and they had the reason for why the intervention should be there, which completely aligned with the data that Gerald had been producing around traffic flows, poor environmental qualities, and so on. So the combination, I think, from a mixed methods perspective, the combination of the sort of more statistical geospatial data analysis with this qualitative approach gave the community a set of tools that they didn't have before. And I think that was really one of the great things that came from this. Interestingly, and I think this is something that we all need to bear in mind, anyone who's interested in sustainability and climate action, when we categorized the topic, why we're interested in greening, when we started categorizing out what those individual comments related to, when we looked at the ones for why is greening important, we expected that climate change would be at the top of the agenda. It was actually the thing people were least concerned about in relation to greening. And for them, what greening was all about was health and well-being, mental health issues, places to exercise, and feeling safe in their environment. It was around the governance, things like people wanted to be able to care and maintain their area, but they were being blocked for all sorts of things like legal reasons and so on within their area, or they didn't know which kind of end of Dublin City Council perhaps to engage with on particular issues. But also greening was very, very closely associated with being a mechanism to resist development pressure. So the area we were in is an area that's undergoing massive transformation right now in terms of high density, high rise development. And people really saw greening as a potential buffer. So this would help them to resist that sense that they were beginning to live in, if you like, a concrete jungle. So really interesting, and something that kind of gave us pause for thought. The climate action really didn't appear here at all when our project started off as being very closely related, I think, to climate and sustainability issues. So all to say that the data that was generated in the data mapping part, the qualitative information that was generated within the community, all came together into an action phase. And this action phase was quite interesting because when we started the project, we had no money for action. We didn't know what we were going to do. We had said to the EPA, we might come back to you looking for money to actually do something. But it kind of took on a life of its own. So as part of this, we had established a neighbourhood greening forum, because through all of our interactions, we identified about 12 people in the area who were really committed to doing something about this. And we set up this neighbourhood greening forum. And actually, it's still in existence. So one of the things the community there are doing now is they have what's called Greenbridge, which is the new name for the neighbourhood greening forum that was set up under Mapping Green Dublin. And they still actively engage, and they're still, I think, really active in terms of how they're engaging themselves with Dublin City Council. But they also came up with a number of smaller projects. So I suppose it all started off by data from us. And requests. I think that's the other thing, Gerald, actually, that we didn't talk about. So as Gerald was producing these maps, the community were coming back going, and we want a map of this, and we want a map of that. So they really began to see what they needed. We then fed that back, and we used it as the basis of conversations that then generated the information through the citizen science, and that then generated ideas for actual projects on the ground. So there's a list here of, I think it's 10 projects that various community members took on to do themselves. So things like Turvey Park, which is a park within the area that had been fairly neglected. Two of the women who were part of the Greenbridge Forum, they just basically said, we're just going to go into the park, we're going to take a corner of the park and do what we want to do with it. They created a sensory space and a kind of a planted lavender and all sorts of beautiful smelling plants and flowers, and did a yoga class there and all sorts of things. Just off their own bat. So that was the real kind of empowerment when people began to take control of their own environment. And other things, little parklets, pocket forests, which was beginning to emerge as a social enterprise at the time. Catherine Cleary, she was part of the Greenbridge Forum, subsequently grown into something much bigger. But one of the first pocket forests was developed as well as part of the projects that came out of this. And then a community strategy. So there was no way that the greening strategy could have been produced without all of the inputs in various ways from the community, and working with them through the kind of information they provided in those events and through those focus groups and workshops and mapping exercises to come up with, I think it's 11 actions that were then presented to Dublin City Council in terms of what's needed to actually implement this greening strategy. What are the 11 key things that could be done to address greening in the area? So I suppose a couple of reflections at the end. One of the things that really we learned, I suppose, from really engaging in this way was that working with citizens and within communities requires time, patience, and sensitivity. And Alma was exceptional, I think, at managing this, because there was quite a lot of historic or legacy issues within the community that made it difficult for some groups to engage with others. And that really required a lot of sensitivity. So I think when you're engaging in citizen science and community-based research, that's really something that's really, really difficult to navigate and takes time, and you need time. So sometimes when you're working to a funder's timelines, it's really challenging. I think clearly articulating the different role and the expertise and the contribution of each partner is critical from the outset, and that actively seeking to power share, because disrupting those dynamics between the so-called expert academics and the communities are the experts in their area. We have scientific expertise, but without the expertise of actually what is it like to live there, that's you know, we couldn't have generated some of the things that we did. But also within the team, we were a complex team with different expertises, and trying to articulate and manage and balance roles within the group was quite challenging. And I think having those different philosophies and approaches and having to mediate them as well at times was a bit challenging. I think one of the biggest things for us, though, and I think the thing that I'm probably most proud of from this project, is the legacy. So Gerald said earlier, oh, this is the project that just keeps giving and giving, and it really does. So the project's actually over 2 years, but it's still rumbling on. You can still see the effects on some of those projects that are happening in the way the community now are just engaging and keeping this going for themselves beyond the official project end date. And I suppose just a final, and I see a typo, which is like glaring at me. You probably don't see it, but it's like a big red dot looking at me in the last one. Co-production and citizen science don't replace other ways of doing research, I don't think, but they add value to other research approaches. So I think it's not a one or the other. It's not that we do citizen science or we don't. It's all of these things are complementary to one another. So I'm going to finish up there, and I think we're happy to answer any questions.